This is TWiT.
Samsung is having a bad year. Credit rating agency Fitch Ratings yesterday predicted further decline by the company. And another analyst slashed his price target for Samsung stock, telling investors to, quote, react now before it's too late. But today, Samsung released new phones made with metal rather than plastic. Roger Cheng is the executive editor for CNET News and joins us now to talk about Samsung's prospects for the future. Welcome, Roger.
Thanks for having me.
Before we get into Samsung's larger picture, can you tell us about the Samsung Galaxy Alpha line?
Yeah, it's the first time that Samsung is using metal on a phone. It's answering one of the bigger complaints of Samsung's phones is that they feel kind of plasticky and cheap. And the phone is it looks really much like a slightly smaller version of the Galaxy S5 with a metal band around it. And the metal band actually looks astonishingly similar to an iPhone. So it's got the same kind of chamfered edges with polished bevel. Even the kind of the holes at the bottom with the speakers are very reminiscent of the iPhone. But it's Samsung's first attempt at incorporating metal, which is something that people have asked about.
So Roger, this is really kind of, it has a very iPhone look-alike kind of thing. Samsung has always had a little bit of iPhone envy, but this one looks even more like the iPhone than ever. How much do you think that's part of their strategy? They've taken a lot of heat for that. What do you think about them still going in that direction yet again?
Yeah, it's really unusual that they would take this route and when incorporating metal for the first time and really just come out with a phone that looks so much like the iPhone. It's an unusual tactic. I talked to them. I contacted Samsung for a comment on that, but obviously they did not want to weigh in on the issue. But yeah, you made the point that Samsung has gotten a lot of criticism for phones that have looked similar to Apple products, and this almost seems like they're taking it up a notch. But again, I feel like this phone is really an experiment for them. It's again the first time incorporating metal. I've talked with them over the years about the difficulties of getting metal into a smartphone, and obviously there's reception issues that come with that. And it's an interesting first step. It may look like the iPhone, but at least
just make sure you hold it. Just make sure you don't hold it wrong. Yeah, just make sure you don't hold it wrong. Right. Otherwise, you won't have any reception problems. The outside edge looks very iPhone-esque. The back looks very Samsung-esque. It's kind of got an upholstered look to it. So that's a little different. So the metal is really around the outside edge. And one part of the explanation, Roger Cheng, I think you would agree, for the odd introduction at this point of an iPhone, it looks like the older iPhones actually, is the fact that even for a fast mover like Samsung, it takes a while to get a phone from the design table to market. And so, they probably started working on this phone a couple of years ago, possibly. We don't know the details of the timing of that, but it's not like they came up with this idea 6 months ago. This takes a while to get these things out there. Now, Roger Cheng, I'm sorry, go ahead, and you wanted to address that.
Yeah, we've actually done a lot of reporting on that. Samsung's actually unusually fast when it comes to the development of new products. Like the original Gear really came together in 18 months. I imagine this phone it took a lot less than a couple of years to develop. I would imagine this phone actually it's more in the months than years, because Samsung has shown it can actually operate really fast when it needs to. And I think this is Samsung responding to the market. The company has received criticism about the materials used for its devices, its flagship devices, and they're a little cagey about whether this is a true flagship device, but it's clear that they're experimenting with this material.
And it also has to be said that Apple copied their plastic before they copied Apple's metal. Sure. Apple was suddenly unapologetically plastic. Now, of course, Samsung is squeezed in both directions. They're kind of in a pickle. They're being squeezed at the low end by Chinese handset makers like Xiaomi, Lenovo, and Huawei, and at the high end by iPhone. One analyst named Mark Newman, who's with Bernstein Research, said that the company needs a, quote, drastic change in smartphone strategy, unquote. What would you advise Samsung as to what their strategy should be, Roger Cheng?
Well, I think Samsung is trying to be everything to everyone, and that's gotten them in trouble. On the high end, I mean, they've obviously done a good job with the Galaxy S5, with the Galaxy S line, the Galaxy Note line. It's really the problems are at the low end, as you mentioned, Xiaomi, Huawei, Lenovo. They've lost their lead in China. They've lost their lead in India. I think it's a matter of creating more competitively priced phones. It's as simple as that. And a lot of their investment spending is devoted towards marketing, and that might have to change. They might have to change their marketing machine a little bit. Maybe on the high end, it's fine, but they tend to charge more than, say, the Chinese competitors for a similar spec phone. So it is about sort of getting more competitive on the low end, and at time deciding whether or not they either want to sacrifice margins and stay in the low end, or be more like Apple and just ignore the low end and then stick with higher margin products. And I think that's a question that Samsung hasn't answered yet.
Now, of course, the background in all this is the competitive marketplace. Traditionally being the last year or two, all of the profits, for the most part, have gone to Apple and Samsung, with Apple probably taking roughly 2/3, Samsung taking roughly 1/3, and everybody else getting zilch in terms of profits. And Samsung, of course, has been declining in profits. Their second quarter net profit dropped 20%, which was considered a disaster, but it's actually pretty impressive in the context of a market where nobody's making any profits except Samsung and Apple. And of course, the big looming disaster on the horizon is that Samsung is losing its grip on consumers across Asia. And once you lose, if you're Samsung and you lose Asia, you're going to be in trouble. This is really a problem for them. Roger Teng, do you have a sense of why it is that the Chinese handset makers like Xiaomi, Lenovo, and Huawei can produce similarly quality phones at lower prices than Samsung? I mean, they're all manufactured in China.
Well, I mean, that's not necessarily true. Samsung manufactures a lot of its own components and a lot of its own phones. They actually have manufacturing facilities in South Korea. They do have some in China as well, but I mean, the Chinese companies just run leaner and overall have lower overhead. They're able to charge lower prices. They're also more aggressive with pricing because they're working to build share, especially overseas. They're in Asia or in China in particular. It's fairly competitive, but if you go overseas, other markets, Huawei, ZTE, these companies are willing to price their products at a really low really low rate, extremely competitive, and it's something that right now Samsung hasn't been able to match.
Yeah, well, I think we're going to be watching them closely. They're going to be branching into all kinds of new areas, including Google Glass-like headsets and also Oculus Rift-style headsets. We're going to be talking about that story in just a minute.
Interesting thing to add along those lines. We have some ZDNet reporters in Korea, and they were talking about how the Korean government is actually investing in 3D printing and tech companies that want to take advantage of 3D printing because they see the writing on the wall that it's going to be difficult for Korean companies to compete with Chinese companies in electronics. So I think that interesting enough, the Koreans are kind of already seeing the writing on the wall that maybe the mobile, the growth in terms of future in tech is not in this area, but the next sort of phase, and they're looking at 3D printing as one of those things.
Yeah, and I think I'm just looking over this. I had a crazy morning, so I wasn't able to see this before the show, so I've been kind of taking it all in. I think we've waited a long time, like a lot of the critics, as has already been said, have waited for the Samsung metal phone if it was ever going to happen. I think it'll be interesting after all this time of people criticizing Samsung for the plastic phone, and I have to consider myself one of those people, myself included, to see if this ends up being a good, like a marketing success for Samsung. If Samsung comes out of the gate with something like this, ends up doing gangbusters, then it's kind of retribution. If not, it's kind of like, hey, we were right all along. But it is interesting from a spec standpoint that the casing is maybe an upgrade, considered by some to be an upgrade, but the internal specs are kind of mid-range. They're certainly not top of the line specs at this particular moment, if that matters.
I don't actually think. I mean, I'm a little skeptical on how well this phone will actually do. The way it was announced with very little fanfare. It was just sort of a press release on its website. There was no event. There wasn't any kind of celebration of this product, and it kind of shows where it sits in its lineup. I mean, it's sort of given the token line that it's a flagship product, but it's really not when you compare to how the Galaxy S5 launched, how the Galaxy Note 4 will launch next month. I mean, these are big events. The Note will launch in a 3-city event, so and this was a no city event, or no event at all. So it kind of shows you where it sits in the lineup. And as I said in my story, it's less about the sales and more about the fact that it's a potential benchmark for Samsung's progress with design. It sort of shows that they're willing to play with new materials, and that's a good thing.
We're talking to Roger Cheng, executive editor at CNET News. Now, Roger, one last question. What do you think they're going to announce at the real event next month? Do you have any predictions?
Oh, yeah. As I said, the Note 4 will be there. I imagine another smartwatch will be there as well. One with possibly standalone cellular capabilities, and then the Oculus virtual reality set that Chris broke yesterday. I've seen it in a number of other publications that's sort of written about over the last couple of months. I imagine that's going to show up there as well. So there's probably going to be a pretty busy, packed event there.
Roger Cheng writes for CNET.com, and you can follow him on Twitter, Roger W. Cheng, Cheng. Thank you so much for joining us, Roger Cheng.
Thanks for having me.
Roger.